Across the training grounds at Fort Benning as Private Maya Chen adjusted her pack straps for the 100th time. At barely 5 feet 2 inches and weighing in at 115 pounds soaking wet, she looked like a child playing dress-up in her oversized military fatigues. The other recruits towered over her, their massive frames making her appear even more diminutive in comparison. "Chen, you keeping up back there, or do you need us to call you a taxi?" Sergeant Rodriguez's voice boomed across the formation, eliciting snickers from the other soldiers. This had become a daily ritual, the gentle mockery disguised as motivation, the assumption that she would inevitably fall behind during their grueling 20-mile march through the Georgia wilderness. Maya had heard it all before. In the 3 months since arriving at basic training, she'd endured countless jokes about her size, her pace, and her chances of making it through the program. Some were meant in good fun, others carried a sharper edge of genuine doubt. Even some of the drill instructors seemed to view her as a liability waiting to happen, a weak link that would eventually snap under pressure. What they didn't know, what Maya had never told anyone, was that she had grown up in the mountains of Colorado, where her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. Her grandmother, a weathered woman of Tibetan descent who had fled her homeland decades earlier, had taught Maya that true strength came not from the size of your muscles, but from the depth of your spirit and the efficiency of your movement. "In the mountains," her grandmother would say in heavily accented English, "the smallest yak can carry the heaviest load if she knows how to distribute the weight properly. The secret is not in fighting the mountain, but in becoming one with it." Those lessons had served Maya well during her childhood, when she would spend entire days hiking treacherous mountain paths, carrying supplies to remote villages cut off by avalanches or storms. She had learned to read terrain like others read books to find the most efficient path even when it wasn't the most obvious one. She had developed a rhythmic, almost meditative walking style that allowed her to cover vast distances without the explosive bursts of energy that would leave others gasping for breath. But here at Fort Benning, efficiency was often mistaken for weakness. When Maya would settle into her steady, measured pace during training runs, maintaining the same rhythm regardless of terrain or weather conditions, the other recruits would surge ahead in displays of raw power and speed. They would laugh as they passed her, calling out encouragements that barely concealed their pity. "Come on, Chen, put some muscle into it. You're making this look harder than it is. Maybe you should have joined the Air Force instead." Maya never responded to the taunts. She simply maintained her pace, her breathing controlled and even, her steps falling in the same hypnotic pattern her grandmother had taught her years ago. She knew something the others didn't, that the human body was capable of extraordinary endurance when it wasn't fighting itself, when every movement flowed naturally into the next like water finding its way downhill. As the weeks progressed, a curious pattern began to emerge. While the other recruits would start each march with explosive energy, charging ahead with determination and bravado, Maya would begin as she always did, slowly, deliberately, almost apologetically. The gap between her and the leaders would grow steadily for the first several miles, sometimes stretching to what seemed like an insurmountable distance. But then, somewhere around the halfway point, something would shift. The pace setters would begin to slow, their initial burst of adrenaline giving way to the grinding reality of sustained effort. Their breathing would become labored, their steps less certain. Some would begin to struggle with cramps or blisters, the price of pushing too hard too fast. Maya, meanwhile, would continue at exactly the same pace she had maintained from the beginning. Her steady rhythm would begin to close the gap, and then, inevitably, she would begin to pass the others. One by one, the soldiers who had mocked her earlier would fall behind as she glided past them with the same serene expression she'd worn at the starting line. By the final miles, Maya would often find herself among the front runners, having covered the same distance as everyone else while expending far less energy. Her uniform would be dry while others were drenched in sweat. Her breathing would remain controlled, while others gasped and wheezed. Most remarkably of all, she would appear almost refreshed by the experience, as if the long march had somehow energized rather than depleted her. The other recruits began to take notice, though they didn't quite know what to make of it. Some attributed it to luck or favorable conditions. Others suggested she must be taking shortcuts or somehow cheating, though no one could ever prove it. A few of the more observant soldiers began to study her technique, trying to understand how someone so small could consistently outperform much larger and seemingly stronger competitors. Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who had seen thousands of recruits pass through his training programs, was perhaps the most intrigued of all. He had initially written Maya off as another well-intentioned recruit who would wash out within weeks. Her small frame and quiet demeanor had suggested weakness to him, an inability to handle the physical and mental demands of military service. But as he watched her performance during training exercises, Rodriguez began to suspect there was more to Private Chen than met the eye. There was something almost mystical about the way she moved, a quality that reminded him of the indigenous guides he had worked with during deployments in Afghanistan. Men who could navigate treacherous mountain terrain for days on end without showing signs of fatigue. Still, doubts lingered. Physical endurance was only one aspect of military service, and there were plenty of situations where raw strength and explosive power mattered more than steady-state efficiency. Rodriguez wondered how Maya would perform when the stakes were raised, when lives were on the line and there was no room for her methodical, measured approach. That question would be answered sooner than anyone expected, during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise in the dense forests of southern Georgia. What started as a standard 25-mile navigation course would become something far more challenging and far more dangerous than anyone had planned. The Georgia forest in late September was a maze of Spanish moss and towering pines, where humidity hung in the air like a living thing, and every step forward required pushing through nature's thick green curtain. 12 soldiers had been divided into 3 teams for what command had labeled a realistic navigation and survival exercise. Each team carried minimal supplies and outdated maps, with instructions to reach a series of checkpoints scattered throughout the 50,000-acre training area. Maya found herself assigned to Team Bravo, along with 3 other soldiers who had drawn the short straws, or so they believed. There was Private Jackson, a muscular recruit from Detroit who never missed an opportunity to flex his biceps and demonstrate his strength. Corporal Williams, a wiry former track star who could sprint faster than anyone in the company but struggled with longer distances. And most significantly, Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Thompson, a 200-pound mountain of a man who had earned his nickname not just for his size, but for his tendency to bulldoze through obstacles rather than navigate around them. Tank Thompson was something of a legend at Fort Benning. At 6 feet 4 inches and built like a linebacker, he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen real combat. His arms were covered in tattoos that told stories of battles fought and brothers lost, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He was also Maya's harshest critic. "Chen, I want you to know up front that I'm not slowing down for anyone today," Tank announced as they gathered around their assigned starting point at 600 hours. "This exercise is about proving we can work as a team under pressure, and that means keeping pace with the strongest members, not accommodating the weakest." His words stung, but Maya had heard variations of the same sentiment countless times before. She simply nodded and adjusted her pack, mentally reviewing the route they would need to take based on her study of the topographical maps the night before. While the others had spent their free time complaining about the exercise or boasting about their expected performance, Maya had quietly analyzed every contour line, every creek bed, every ridge that might offer an advantage or present an obstacle. The Dean. First checkpoint lay 8 miles to the northeast, through terrain that the map indicated would be challenging. Steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and at least 2 creek crossings that might be difficult to navigate depending on recent rainfall. Tank's plan was typically straightforward: head directly toward the objective, pushing through whatever obstacles they encountered with brute force and determination. Maya could see potential problems with this approach, but she knew better than to speak up. Tank had made it clear that he was in charge, and challenging his authority would only reinforce his perception of her as a troublemaker who couldn't be trusted to follow orders. The first few miles went exactly as Maya had expected. Tank set a punishing pace, charging through the forest like a man possessed, with Jackson and William struggling to keep up. Maya fell behind almost immediately, her steady, measured pace no match for Tank's aggressive push through the undergrowth. "Jen, pick up the pace or we're leaving you behind," Tank shouted over his shoulder, not bothering to slow down or look back. This isn't a nature hike. Maya maintained her rhythm, reading the terrain ahead and choosing her path carefully. While the others crashed through thickets and stumbled over hidden roots, she found game trails and natural corridors that allowed her to move more efficiently. Still, the gap between her and the team leaders continued to grow, and she could hear their voices growing fainter as they pressed on without her. By mile 4, Maya could no longer see or hear the others, but she wasn't concerned. She had memorized their intended route and knew she could catch up when the terrain became more challenging. Her grandmother's lessons echoed in her mind. The mountain does not care how fast you climb it. It only cares whether you understand. It's nature. The first sign of trouble came from the direction Maya had last seen her teammates. A sharp crack that might have been a falling branch followed by a shout that was abruptly cut short. Maya paused, listening intently, but heard only the normal sounds of the forest. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. She quickened her pace slightly, following the obvious trail of bent branches and disturbed earth that Tank's team had left in their wake. Another 15 minutes of hiking brought her to the edge of a steep ravine that hadn't been clearly marked on their outdated maps. Recent storms had carved the gully deeper than expected, creating a drop of nearly 20 feet to a rocky creek bed below. At the bottom of the ravine, Maya could see Tank Thompson lying motionless beside the creek, his massive frame crumpled at an unnatural angle. Jackson was kneeling beside him, his face pale with panic, while Williams paced back and forth like a caged animal, muttering strings of profanity that echoed off the ravine walls. "Thank God," Jackson called up when he spotted Maya at the rim. "We need help down here. Tank fell when the edge gave way. I think his leg is broken, maybe worse." Maya quickly assessed the situation. The walls of the ravine were too steep and unstable for a direct descent, but she spotted a more gradual slope about 50 yards to the east, where erosion had created a natural path down to the creek bed. She made her way to that point and carefully picked her way down the treacherous incline. Tank was conscious but clearly in severe pain. His left leg was bent at an angle that made Maya wince, and there was a nasty gash on his forehead where he had struck a rock during his fall. More concerning was the shallow, rapid breathing that suggested he might have internal injuries as well. "How bad is it?" Maya asked Jackson, kneeling beside Tank to check his pulse and examine his injuries more closely. "Bad," Jackson replied, his voice shaking. He was trying to jump across the creek when the bank gave way. Fell hard on his left side. "William says we should leave him here and go get help, but—" He gestured helplessly at their surroundings. The problem was obvious, to Maya even before Jackson spelled it out. They were at least 12 miles from the nearest road, in terrain that would be difficult for rescue vehicles to navigate. Even if they could somehow signal for help, it would take hours for a medical team to reach them, time that Tank might not have if his injuries were as serious as they appeared. "We can't leave him," Maya said quietly, her mind already working through the possibilities. "Look at his color. Look at his breathing. He needs medical attention now, not in 6 hours." Williams, who had been pacing frantically, stopped and stared at her. "Are you insane? He weighs over 200 pounds. There's no way the three of us can carry him 12 miles through this terrain. We'd kill ourselves trying, and probably kill him too." Maya ignored Williams and focused on Tank, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. She had seen injuries like this before, during her childhood in the mountains when climbing accidents or avalanches would leave people stranded far from help. Her grandmother had taught her that in such situations, conventional wisdom often had to be set aside in favor of solutions that seemed impossible but were actually just unconventional. "Jackson, I need you to fashion a stretcher from those fallen branches," she said, her voice taking on a calm authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Use your belt and boot laces to lash them together. Williams, gather as much moss and soft pine boughs as you can find. We need to cushion him for transport." "You're not listening," Williams protested. "We can't carry him. He's too heavy and we're too far from—" "We're not carrying him," Maya interrupted. "I am." The silence that followed Maya's declaration was broken only by Tank's labored breathing and the gentle gurgle of the creek flowing past them. Jackson and Williams stared at her as if she had just announced her intention to sprout wings and fly. "Them all to safety." "Chen, I know you mean well," Jackson said carefully, "but this isn't the time for heroics. Tank outweighs you by almost 100 pounds. You can't—" "My grandmother once told me about a Tibetan woman who carried her unconscious husband 17 miles through a blizzard," Maya said, kneeling beside Tank and gently checking his pulse again. It was getting weaker. The woman weighed 90 pounds. Her husband weighed 160. Everyone said it was impossible, but she understood something they didn't. She looked up at Williams and Jackson, her dark eyes intense with a focus they had never seen before. She understood that the human body isn't designed to fight gravity. It's designed to work with it. The secret isn't in being strong enough to lift the weight. It's in distributing the load so efficiently that you barely feel it at all. Williams shook his head in disbelief. "That's a nice story, Chen, but this is reality. You're talking about carrying a 200-pound man through 12 miles of forest. Even if you could somehow manage the weight, the terrain will kill you. Ravines, fallen trees, creek crossings. The terrain is exactly why this will work." Maya interrupted, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that surprised even her. Tank was thinking like a soldier. Straight lines, direct routes, pushing through obstacles. "But I'm thinking like the mountain people my grandmother taught me about. We don't fight the mountain. We become part of it." She turned to Jackson. "I need you to help me get him positioned properly. And Williams, I need you to scout ahead, but not the route Tank was planning. Look for the path of least resistance. Animal trails, natural drainage patterns, anything that follows the contours instead of cutting across them." As Jackson reluctantly began fashioning a crude stretcher from fallen branches, Maya knelt beside Tank and began what looked like a strange ritual. She placed her hands on different parts of his body, his shoulders, his hips, his legs, as if she were measuring something invisible. Her grandmother had taught her this technique years ago, explaining that every body had natural balance points, places where weight could be distributed most efficiently. "Tank," she said softly, noting that his eyes had fluttered open. "I need you to stay conscious if you can. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to work with me, not against me." Tank's voice was barely a whisper. "Chen. Can't. Too heavy. Trust me," Maya said, and something in her tone made Tank's eyes focus on her face. "Do you remember what you said about accommodation? About not slowing down for the weakest members?" Tank managed the faintest nod. "You were right about one thing." Maya continued. "This exercise is about proving we can work as a team, but you were wrong about who the weak members are." With Jackson's help, Maya carefully positioned Tank on the makeshift stretcher, using techniques her grandmother had shown her for securing loads on pack animals. But instead of trying to lift the stretcher in the conventional way, she did something that seemed impossible to the others watching. She backed up to Tank's head, squatted down, and positioned the stretcher so that Tank's weight would rest primarily on her back and hips, the strongest part of her body. Using a complex arrangement of straps fashioned from their belts and paracord, she created a harness system that distributed Tank's weight across her entire frame, from her shoulders down to her legs. When she stood up, Tank came with her. Jackson's mouth fell open. Williams stopped pacing and stared. Maya was carrying all 200 pounds of Tank Thompson, and while the strain was visible on her face, she wasn't collapsing under the weight as they had expected. The secret, Maya explained, her breathing controlled despite the enormous load, is that I'm not carrying him. The harness system is carrying him. I'm just providing the locomotion and the balance. My grandmother's people used similar techniques to transport everything from grain to goats across mountain passes that would be impossible to navigate any other way. She took a few experimental steps, adjusting her gait to accommodate the new center of gravity. The movement was slow and deliberate, but it was movement. Tank wasn't touching the ground, and Maya wasn't collapsing. "This is insane," Williams muttered, but his tone had shifted from disbelief to amazement. Maya looked at him steadily. "Williams, I need you to be my pathfinder. Jackson, you're carrying our emergency supplies and Tank's weapon. We're going to move slowly, but we're going to move constantly. No rest stops except for medical checks. No direct routes. We follow the terrain, not the map." What followed was unlike anything the three soldiers had ever experienced. Maya set off through the forest with Tank strapped to her back, moving in the same rhythmic, measured pace she had used during training exercises. But now that pace took on an almost hypnotic quality, each step perfectly calibrated to maintain balance and conserve energy. Williams, scouting ahead, began to understand what Maya meant about working with the terrain instead of fighting it. Instead of the direct route Tank had planned, which would have involved multiple steep climbs and dangerous creek crossings, Maya's path wound through the forest like water finding the easiest way downhill. They followed deer trails and natural ridgelines, took advantage of fallen logs as bridges, and used the slope of the land to assist their movement rather than impede it. The most remarkable thing was Maya's breathing. Despite carrying a load that was nearly twice her own body weight, her respiration remained steady and controlled. She had found a rhythm that allowed her cardiovascular system to work efficiently, never pushing into the anaerobic zone that would quickly lead to exhaustion. "How are you doing this?" Jackson asked during one of their brief medical checks on Tank, who remained conscious but weak. "My grandmother used to say that the body is like a river," Maya replied, carefully adjusting Tank's position to ensure he remained stable. "When a river tries to flow uphill, it exhausts itself and accomplishes nothing. But when it follows the natural path, it can move mountains over time. I'm not trying to be stronger than this load. I'm trying to be smarter than it." As they continued through the forest, something extraordinary began to happen. Williams, who had initially been reluctant to participate in what he considered a foolish rescue attempt, found himself completely absorbed in the task of path-finding. He began to see the forest through Maya's eyes, recognizing opportunities and obstacles that would have been invisible to him before. Jackson, meanwhile, was learning lessons about teamwork that no amount of classroom instruction could have taught. He found himself anticipating Maya's needs, clearing branches from her path, offering water and encouragement without being asked. The three of them were functioning as a unit in ways that their previous training exercises had never achieved. But perhaps the most profound change was in Tank himself. As he lay strapped to Maya's back, conscious but helpless, he began to understand something about leadership and strength that his years of military service had never taught him. This tiny soldier he had dismissed as a liability was literally carrying him to safety, using skills and knowledge that had nothing to do with conventional measures of physical prowess. Miles passed beneath Maya's steady pace. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent toward the horizon. Maya's uniform became soaked with sweat, and her legs began to shake with fatigue, but she never slowed down. Her pace remained as constant as a metronome, each step a part of a larger rhythm that seemed to encompass not just her movement, but the movement of the entire team through the forest. By late afternoon, they could hear the distant sound of vehicles. They were approaching the extraction point where the exercise was scheduled to conclude. Williams, who had been scouting ahead, came running back with news that changed everything about their situation and Maya's place in the unit forever. "There's a problem," Williams announced breathlessly as he rejoined the group. "The extraction point is crawling with emergency vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks, even a helicopter. Something's gone wrong with one of the other teams." Maya carefully lowered Tank to the ground for what she hoped would be their final rest before reaching safety. Her legs were trembling with exhaustion, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but Tank's vital signs had remained stable throughout their journey. More importantly, he had stayed conscious for the last several miles, even managing to crack a few weak jokes that suggested his condition was improving. "What kind of problem?" Jackson asked, offering Maya water from his canteen. She drank gratefully, her hands shaking slightly as she held the container. "I couldn't get close enough to see details, but I overheard radio chatter," Williams replied. "Sounds like Team Alpha got lost in the swamp section and one of their members went hypothermic. Team Charlie had a different kind of accident. Something about a rappelling line failure during a creek crossing. Multiple injuries." Maya felt her heart sink. The exercise that was supposed to test their individual capabilities had turned into a series of genuine emergencies. She looked down at Tank, who was listening to the conversation with growing concern despite his own condition. "How far are we from the extraction point?" Maya asked. "Maybe half a mile," Williams answered. "But Chen, there's something else. I saw Sergeant Rodriguez organizing search parties. They're looking for us. Our team was supposed to check in at 1400 hours, and it's now past 1600. They think we're missing too." Tank managed to prop himself up on his elbows. "Chen," he said, his voice stronger than it had been hours earlier, "you need to go ahead without me. Get to the extraction point and bring back help. You've done enough, more than enough. But if they're organizing search parties, that means they're pulling resources away from the other teams who need help." Maya stared at him in disbelief. "After carrying you 8 miles through the forest, you think I'm going to abandon you? When we're half a mile from safety?" "It's not abandonment," Tank insisted. "It's tactical thinking. You get help to me faster by going ahead than by continuing to carry me, and other soldiers need—" "No." Maya's voice carried a finality that surprised everyone, including herself. "My grandmother had another saying, 'The mountain doesn't care how many people you save if you lose your soul in the process.' I'm not leaving you behind." She began the process of getting Tank repositioned on her back once again, but Jackson stepped forward. "Maya," he said quietly, "Tank's right about one thing. You've proven your point 100 times over. No one will ever question your strength or your commitment again. But look at yourself. You're exhausted. Your hands are shaking. What if you collapse in the next half mile? Then we're both casualties instead of just one." Maya paused in her preparations, feeling the weight of their arguments. Part of her knew they were right from a purely tactical standpoint. But another part, the part her grandmother had shaped during those long mountain journeys, refused to accept any solution that involved abandoning someone she had committed to helping. "There's a third option," she said finally. "Williams, how loud can you yell?" Williams looked confused. "Pretty loud, I guess. Why?" "Because we're going to announce our arrival. Jackson, do you still have that emergency whistle on your kit?" As understanding dawned on their faces, Maya explained her plan. Instead of trying to sneak into the extraction point or send someone ahead for help, they would make enough noise to ensure the rescue teams found them. Williams would use his considerable lung power to call out their position, while Jackson used his whistle to create a signal that would carry through the forest. "But won't that interfere with the search operations for the other teams?" Williams asked. "No," Maya replied, hefting Tank onto her back one final time. "It will help them. Right now, the rescue coordinators are dealing with multiple unknowns. They don't know where we are, what our condition is, or how many resources they need to allocate to finding us. By announcing ourselves, we remove one variable from their equation. They can focus their search efforts on the teams that are genuinely lost. As they began their final approach to the extraction point, with Williams calling out their position every few minutes and Jackson providing whistle signals, Maya reflected on how dramatically the day had changed her understanding of leadership and teamwork. When they had started the exercise that morning, she had been the outsider, the weak link that everyone expected to fail. Now, as she carried Tank Thompson through the final stretch of Georgia forest, Maya realized that strength came in forms that couldn't be measured in a gym or demonstrated on an obstacle course. True strength was about understanding your capabilities and limitations, about finding solutions that others couldn't see, and about committing to see things through even when conventional wisdom said it was impossible. The first rescue personnel they encountered was a medic who took one look at Maya carrying Tank and immediately radioed for additional support. Within minutes, they were surrounded by paramedics and military personnel who began the process of transferring Tank to professional medical care. "Son of a bitch," said a familiar voice behind Maya. She turned to see Sergeant Rodriguez approaching, his expression a mixture of amazement and concern. "Chen, please tell me you didn't just carry Thompson 8 miles through the forest." 12 miles, Sergeant, Tank corrected weakly from his stretcher, managing a smile despite his obvious pain. And she did it without breaking pace once. Rodriguez stared at Maya for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "I've been training soldiers for 20 years, Chen, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. How did you even—" "My grandmother taught me that the mountain doesn't care how big you are," Maya interrupted quietly. "It only cares whether you understand how to work with it instead of fighting against it." As the medical team prepared to transport Tank to the hospital, he grabbed Maya's hand weakly. "Chen," he said, his voice serious despite his exhaustion, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I was wrong about you, about what strength looks like, about what it means to be a soldier." Maya squeezed his hand gently. "You don't owe me anything, Tank. We're a team. That's what teams do. They take care of each other." Later, as Maya sat in the medical tent having her own minor injuries treated, blisters, muscle strain, and dehydration, she could hear the radio chatter about the other rescue operations. Team Alpha had been successfully extracted from the swamp, with the hypothermic soldier expected to make a full recovery. Team Charlie's repelling accident had resulted in more serious injuries, but all personnel were stable and receiving appropriate medical care. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at the tent opening. "Chen, I need you to know that your actions today are going to be written up for commendation. What you did was extraordinary." Maya looked up from the medic who was bandaging her feet. "Sergeant, with respect, I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what needed to be done. That," Rodriguez replied with a smile, "is exactly what makes it extraordinary." As the sun set over the Georgia forest, Maya reflected on the day's events. When she had woken up that morning, she had been the soldier everyone expected to fail, the weak link in a chain of stronger personalities. Now, as medical personnel and fellow soldiers sought her out to shake her hand and ask about her techniques, she realized that perception had fundamentally changed. But more importantly, her own understanding of her place in the military had evolved. She was no longer the outsider trying to prove she belonged. She was a soldier with unique capabilities, skills that complemented rather than competed with those of her teammates. The mockery and doubt she had endured during training had been replaced by something far more valuable, genuine respect earned through action rather than words. The following Monday, when their unit assembled for morning formation, Maya noticed that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of the group. Soldiers who had previously ignored or dismissed her now sought her advice on endurance techniques and efficient movement. Tank Thompson, walking with crutches but determined to participate in formation, made a point of standing beside her rather than with the other non-commissioned officers. Most significantly, when Sergeant Rodriguez announced the next training exercise, a 30-mile navigation course through even more challenging terrain, there was no laughter when Maya began her familiar slow, steady pace. Instead, several soldiers asked if they could observe her technique and learn from her approach. As Maya settled into the rhythm that had served her so well throughout her military training, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice carried on the morning breeze. The smallest yak can carry the heaviest load, little mountain flower, not because she is strong enough to fight the weight, but because she is wise enough to become one with it. The mountain had taught Maya Chen its most important lesson, that true strength isn't about overpowering obstacles, but about finding the path that allows you to move through them with grace, efficiency, and unwavering determination. And on. That day in the Georgia forest, when everyone had laughed at her for slowing down, she had proven that sometimes the longest journey begins with a single, perfectly measured step.